Almost done with Sunday. Everybody having a good time? All right. So our next speaker has been doing this now for about 5 years. 5 years. I was right. See, my memory is better than I think it is. I'm just going to not do anything more than, this is Dr. Dana Bevan, and she's going to tell all about herself and the topic at hand.
Well, thank you. We've had a few technical problems, so we're a little bit late, but I'll try to make up time so you can ask questions. I'm Dana Bevan, and I'm going to talk a little bit about science as it relates to transgender issues. There's a lot out there in terms of politics and accusations and so on. And the facts tend to get lost in the shuffle. So I'm going to try to give you some notion about what's going on. My logo is I'm the transgender scientist, but so everybody's got to have something that they can talk about, and that's the name of my podcast and some of my books. A few things about me. First of all, I'm transgender, as you might have gathered. I went to some pretty good schools. Unfortunately, they were all male schools at the time, and I was probably one of the few transgender people at those schools. At any rate, in my graduate studies, they said you can't study transgender science because nobody will give you any money for it. So I went into the military after that and became a Cold War warrior to try to earn a living and to try to be helpful. So I'm not an academic, so you can feel somewhat safe that I don't have an axe to grind. I'm not looking for grant money from the government. The reason I got into this was that I was entertaining the idea of transitioning, that is, changing my body to make it closer to being female so that it would better align with my gender, which was feminine. And I wanted to know whether this was legit or not. You know, why should people do this? Why do people do this? And all the details. So about 2004, I switched gears and I started working on trying to understand being transgender. I do blog monthly at TG Forum, and I have some video and other blogs which are also under Transgender Scientist. Since 2004, I've been busy trying to understand what's going on. And in order to do that, I joined some organizations. One is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is the worldwide authority on providing guidance on how to treat transgender people. I was a director on the U.S. version of that, and for a time. And they get involved with some of these issues in terms of trying to put out the facts. I'm also a member of the American Psychological Association. I'm not a clinician. I'm a research psychologist. And currently I'm working on TRANSKIDS. We have a task force to put together all the information on TRANSKID treatment, some of which I'll relate to you. I'm also on the task force to look at violence against black trans women, which there are a lot of prominent murders and violent acts against trans women in the question is why and what to do about it from a psychology point of view. And finally, locally, I'm a member of the Ryan White Task Force. Now, Ryan White is a grant program to the localities here to provide treatment for HIV. And many, too many transgender people are infected with HIV, and so I get involved with trying to relate what I know about being transgender to the administration of that grant. Okay, so here's the outline. I'm going to talk about three issues. One is transgender, bring you up to date on what's going on with trans kids. And the debate there has to do with what's called affirmative treatment. And I'll describe what that is and what we know so far. It's a relatively new treatment. And then one of the debating points about whether trans kids should get this treatment is some people maintain that transgender kids will naturally grow out of it during their teenage years and young adult years. And so take a look at some of the science that's there. And then there are all kinds of ideologies floating around, transgender movements floating around, which are totally confusing. I'll try to reduce that confusion by defining what those are and where each of those are coming from, so that you can make up your own mind when you hear some of these debates. And then finally, a few words on how we doing, on transgender tolerance and acceptance in the United States. And two things. One is the trans kids. The other is there are several movements, some of which were spawned in the dining room of Louise Lawrence, who's shown in the lower right-hand corner. She was a trans person in San Francisco, and I'll point out some of the movements that she furthered. Okay, a few definitions. We just had a session a few sessions ago on definitions that we ended up talking about scientific definitions. And sex and gender and being transgender are always subject to lots of people making up their own definitions. These are my definitions, but they are as near to my understanding of what science is about. First of all, sex refers to whether you're male or female, and that's typically determined by a doctor or a midwife when you're born. And some people will say that sex is determined by chromosomes or genes, but it's almost never determined that way from a practical point of view. And it's beyond the state of the art to go from a full genome on a person to determine what sex they are. It turns out there's 6,000 genes that determine sex, and they're not all X and Y chromosome genes. So sex is a biological phenomena, and gender, however, refers to behavior. The background on this is that John Money, who's shown down here in the right-hand corner, back in the 50s and 60s, had kids who were of indeterminate gender, or indeterminate sex. That is, that the doctors couldn't determine what sex they were, so he had to tell the parents how to raise them, and so he invented this term gender, which refers to behaviors that society, cultures have deemed to be gender behaviors. And they typically fall into two categories, and Western culture, and that's masculine and feminine. In other cultures, they may have up to 5 different gender categories. So we are a special case of that. Now, transgender people are those that don't behave in the gender category that they were assigned according to their sex. That is, most people, if they're assigned male, are automatically assigned to the masculine gender category, and female are assigned to the feminine gender category at birth. But transgender people don't do that. They either adopt a different gender category, or they mix and match their behaviors according to their genetic predisposition. Okay, so TRANSKIDS issues. The history of this, excuse me, I need my glasses. We've had a few technical issues, so I can't read the view graphs. The history of this is that before the aughts, before the 2000s, there really wasn't any treatment for transgender kids. When I was a kid, which was back in the dark ages, there was no way that the only thing they did was send you to an insane asylum, and maybe they would subject you to chemical castration, lots of other potential kinds of treatments. But fortunately, I eluded all of those. But so there was no really any effective treatment for trans kids until about 20 years ago. The ones who were being treated by psychiatrists and psychologists weren't really trans. They were what we would call pre-homosexual. They were focused on sex and other people, and so they were a problem for parents because they were focused and doing things that the parents didn't really understand. So they ended up in clinics. Now you say, and you may know your history, in 1978, supposedly that was the end of treatment for gay people, but the mental health people managed to continue to treat these pre-homosexual kids by changing the definition of what transgender was. So most of them were, as we'll see, I'll show you some statistics later. What happened was in the early 2000s is that the Dutch were tired of seeing suicide rates for trans kids in the 40s. I've seen some of the statistics somewhere between 38 and 45. They said, well, we've got to do something about this. So they invented affirmative treatment for trans kids. And I'll describe what that is in a bit. But essentially, it's a team approach involving MDs, endocrinologists, parents, the children, and mental health people. The idea is that the parents should have as much advice as possible and as much information as possible to guide their decisions. And that still continues today in spite of some of the things you'll read. Now there's some 65 gender clinics across the U.S. The affirmative treatment was exported here and caught on very quickly. So they are in most of the major cities and university hospitals. However, in the past year, many states have introduced legislation to ban treatment of transgender children, that is, any kind of treatment, but especially affirmative treatment. And that's been passed in a few states. It's now held in abeyance by the courts. This became a political issue, and I'll explain why a little later. And Texas has determined that parents who support their children with affirmative treatment are committing child abuse. So that's being held in abeyance in courts as well. And then finally, Florida just cut off transgender kids from care who were on Medicaid. So it's a real live issue currently, and one that you probably hear about all the time. Okay. So what's affirmative treatment? Well, the definition that the previous definition, which included pre-homosexual kids, was tightened to make transgender people, transgender kids, persistent, and consistent over several months. That they weren't going to change their opinions about their congruent gender. The first phase of affirmative treatment is what's called social transition, and that's totally reversible. It's just dressing the kids in the gender that is congruent for them. Although some parents have done things like move out of town to other neighborhoods so that their kids wouldn't know what their previous assigned gender was. The next thing that's available are what's called puberty blockers. These are drugs that act on the brain to block puberty. They're similar to drugs that weightlifters are not supposed to use that regulate testosterone and other things. So these have been around for quite a while. Back in the 80s, they were started, and they were used primarily for kids who went into puberty at too early an age. So there's pretty good experience with those drugs. And to the extent that we know they are reversible, although that's a subject of intense research. And I'll talk a little about that later. At 16, the affirmative treatment says you cannot continue puberty blockers. And you have to either let nature take its course and go to whatever puberty your body wants it to go, or at that point in time, you're allowed to take sex hormones to change their bodies. Then that's somewhat reversible. I mean, there are some aspects of that can't be reversed with surgery. And then for for females who at 16 who have declared that they want to be in the masculine gender category, mastectomy is available. But again, it's not automatic, and it's not very common. And then finally, at 18, or at the age of majority, the child's eligible for, and I have my own acronym here, it's transgender genital plastic surgery. You've heard that under other less flattering names like sex change surgery, but the true name of it is transgender genital plastic surgery. And that's not easily reversible. Now, all through this process, the child can opt out, or the parents can opt out if things aren't going well, or if they change their minds. No one's forcing them to go all the way in terms of this treatment regime. So you see on television, you see kids who got a ways along in the affirmative treatment and then decided that wasn't for them. So, and that's a good thing. But a lot of the anti-transgender people use that as a criticism of the process. And all along here, it's really the parents' rights in our country and in other countries. It's the parents who decide whether this happens. Although there have been some concern whether the children are capable of providing informed consent. But it's not up to the children, it's up to the parents in all these procedures. So does this work? Well, the answer is yes, it works. Trans kids have better health and better mental health and better health in general. Their suicidality, that is, attempted suicide, decreases. The blockers are well tolerated. I've not heard of too many problems with those. They come in two forms. One is just an injection every several months, but the other is an implant underneath the skin, back in underneath the elbow. But that has not been a problem. Now, research to look at this. This is Katrina Olson, who's at Princeton University, and she won a Genius grant from the MacArthur Foundation, which is $500,000, to study trans kids going through this process. And she's found out some interesting things. First of all, transgender kids are not confused about gender. They know exactly what gender is all about, what are the different behaviors, what are the different categories. And she even tried to trick them into an experimental design. And they came through with shining colors that they know what it's all about. And most kids do know about gender by the age of 2 to 3. Most people don't realize that, but gender's all around. You know, parents are teaching gender, all the examples they see every day. So kids learn that pretty quick. That doesn't mean they know anything about sex, of course. It means they know about gender behaviors that they see and are told about. And by 4 to 6, most of them know that they're trans, or at least they know that there's something different about them. In my case, it was my 4th Christmas. I know exactly when it was. And of course, my parents said, don't tell anybody. So I didn't tell anybody for 50 years. But both of them knew. So one of the concerns is that about bone growth. It turns out that sex hormones, testosterone, estradiol, estrogen, are not just sex hormones. They have other roles, one of which is regulating bone growth. And actually you'll see in young infant boys that they'll have a surge of testosterone about age 1, which kind of kicks off their bone growing process. And then they also have at teenage years some non-trans kids, boys, males who get a surge of estradiol, which of course is embarrassing because it causes breast growth and other problems. And that's pretty well understood. So there's some concern about the reversibility of the puberty blockers. So far, that looks good. So far, there are examples of trans kids being able to conceive later on in life. So there's no physical effect that's of concern so far, but they're intensely looking at that. The other thing they're looking at is cognitive effects. Transgender kids are just as smart and stupid as every other kid, but they are doing cognitive measurements to see if there's any ill effect from this. And there are people who are looking at this like a hawk. I mean, if anything does turn up, it will change how things are looked at. One interesting thing is that because of all these state laws, the several organizations who are normally science organizations have published papers refuting point by point, say, the Florida Surgeon General about his claims about trans kids. And you can see some of those there, but that's unusual. In the task force that I'm on American Psychological Association, our findings won't come out until probably early next year. But at any rate, so the science community is responding to these with facts. So is being transgender forever? Looks like it is. I know lots of people who are in their, even my contemporaries who discover that they need to express being trans in 40s, 50s, 60s. So it's there. And there are a lot of reasons why they don't express that, mostly that they have families and jobs and stuff. But it doesn't, from my point of view, my experience tells me that it is forever. But if you look at the data, there were a number of papers dating back into the 90s where they were treating these children that they were calling trans. Well, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they were pretty overt about it. These were pre-homosexual kids. And if you look at, I went back and did a tally of those children, and of 162 across all those papers, 62% of them were pre-homosexual. They were clearly labeled that way, and they grew up that way as adults. And only a handful were transgender. So that's the data. Now there's data out there that says that there's data used out there that says that transgender kids desist. But that's not true. What happens is they weren't trans in the first place. They were pre-homosexual kids, and that's what they grew up to be. And then there is one of the earlier studies, looks like the transgender kids, they did a good selection using the new criteria that it looks like it's pretty persistent. But it also in that study, a lot of the children didn't tell their parents because they were afraid their parents would reject them. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about there's a lot of talk about transgender ideology. Well, there are 7 of them, so you can't tell the players without a scorecard. So I'm going to give you a bit of a scorecard here. Okay, so you've all seen the movie about Dora and Magnus Hirschfeld and the first transsexual person back in the 30s. Maybe you haven't, but what we're talking about there is the beginning of what were called transsexuals, and transsexuals wanted to change their bodies to make them more conformal to their gender. And there are still lots of them around, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The great majority of trans people are what I would term cross-dressers, and that's what they call themselves. They don't consistently present in their congruent gender. They do that periodically. I call them recreational transgender people. And a lot of them do it under secrecy. Then there are the urban folks, the urban indigents, and I'll talk more about those. You've heard about Stonewall. That was one of the kickoffs for Stonewall of those folks. Female to male, that is people born female and deciding that they wanted to transition to male. That wasn't automatic. That had to come in the 80s. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Let's see, there are among some of the larger denominations, there are people are being encouraged, transgender people are being encouraged to join. That's partly because a lot of those denominations lost people because people wouldn't put up with the way trans and LGBT people were treated. But they are trying to make a comeback. Some of them are anyway. Then there's the conservative religious movement, which was documented earlier in this session. And those are the people who attack transgender people. And they're the ones pushing for these laws that to ban treatment for transgender people and ban them from athletics and so forth. And then there's another group that's been around for a while. I term them the critical queer theory people. RAPMO stands for Reified Applied Postmodernism, if you care, and you can read all about that. But these are people who are using transgender issues to criticize culture in order to gain power. So I'll go one by one, try to give you a little background. The transsexuals are still around. Back in 2000, the estimate was there were 48,000 in the United States. Given 20 years, I think right now it's more like 250,000 of the 2 million or so transgender people who are out there. It's been controversial because some of the gender clinics were run by people with strong religious convictions, and they decided that this violated their religious rules. So it's been on and off for a while, but this fellow, Harry Benjamin, who you see on the right, championed transsexual people getting what they needed in terms of hormones and surgeries. So the WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, was originally entitled the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, and he was a pioneer there. Now, what happened in 1960 was they suddenly came to the realization, although they knew it before, was transsexuals weren't changing their sex because of their sex, they were changing because of their gender. And that's where we got the word transgender from. It was originally to apply to those folks. Okay, cross-dressers got organized back in early 70s. It is the largest group of trans people probably 80%. And they still have peer groups, and I'm a member of several Zoom call groups, one in New York and one in Detroit. So they're still out there, and they still have their own issues. And that was started by this lady named Virginia Prince, also in San Francisco, with Harry. At the same time, Harry Benjamin was out there. Then there are you've heard about Stonewall. Well, Stonewall wasn't the first. The first one was back in 1959, some 10 years before. And there were transgender people leading the way in all of these. You could say they were rioting, and they probably were, because the police in all these places were raiding the establishments, doing strip searches in public, the trans people, and they just had enough. So a lot of the transgender people, and to this day, a lot of them are homeless because they've been thrown out of their houses and their communities. And they also often engage in street economies, including intravenous drugs, which is where the HIV business comes in. Then there was Lou Sullivan, who's up in the upper right-hand corner. He started the female to trans movement. Again, it was started out in San Francisco. Now there are several major religious organizations that are pressing to get transgender members and to be transgender tolerant. Some of them are fully accepted. Others want the trans people to come in so that it can tell them that they're being sinful. That doesn't last very long, I hope. But it is going on, and that's probably a good thing. The Catholics, not so much. The Pope likened transgender people to nuclear arms on society. But the contradiction there is that the Catholic Church blesses both the Muxi, which are in southern Mexico, who are third gender, transgender people, if you will, and also the Feminello, who are dressed in Naples, down the street from the Vatican. So they're not totally consistent on their opposition. Okay, and then recently there's been more research about conservative religious movements, and I'm concerned mainly with them about transgender, but Mr. Fish earlier on in the Skeptics track talked in more generalities about this. But what really happened was that Jimmy Carter, one of our presidents and from Georgia, decided that after school desegregation decision that Christian schools should not discriminate against children because of their color, and so he cut them off in terms of tax-exempt status, and that set off a chain reaction of problems primarily in the South, where there were lots of disaffected people from the Democratic Party who moved over to the Republican Party. And these gentlemen down below were some of the masterminds for that, Paul Weyrich and Laszlo from Hungary. So this group is still very active, trying to make hay out of transgender issues. And then the final one I'll talk about is what's called critical queer theory, and that's really an outgrowth of the free love movement of the '60s. If anybody who lived in the 60s, I did. The philosophical background to that was Herbert Marcuse's Sexual Liberation book, and then subsequently it was followed by Evie Sedgwick, who codified queer theory. Marcuse was very instrumental in teaching teachers. He was at Duke, and he was highly influential about what teachers should teach, including about LGBT and sex issues, because he wanted to have an impact on the culture. So there's a good book that describes all this by Pluckrose and Lindsay, called Critical Theories, in which they describe it as reified, applied postmodernism, but in this case it's applied to queer theory. One more. Okay, so how are we doing? Well, in terms of people knowing transgender people, we're doing pretty well. We're at 42%, and that's a growth of 8% over the last few years. I always encourage transgender people to get out there and meet as many people as they have, but to be good ambassadors because not that they're representing all trans people, but people will associate that with trans people, whether they're not good or not. And then 18 to 29, in the 18 to 29 age group, the number is 53% who say they know a transgender person. And then overall, 64% of Americans believe that trans people should be protected in a job and elsewhere. So we seem to be doing pretty well. It's despite the politicians, the culture seems to be accepting. So I'm going to take questions now. I will take questions. We will bring up the lights, and if you have questions about this or any transgender issue, please come to the microphone. Do not touch the microphone, as I've been told, and I'll be glad to field any questions you have about these issues.
Hi.
Yeah.
You had said earlier that you had spent the first 50 or so years of your life not before you transitioned.
Yes.
Would you be willing to speak a little bit to what it was like to live in a society where you didn't feel like you could transition?
It was not pleasant. It got in the way of friendships and other relationships, because I was constantly thinking about, well, what did I do Saturday night? What do I tell people at the water cooler? I was at a trans meeting, and I can't tell them that. So it really interfered with friendships, because I didn't want them to associate things that I was doing, or they would come to the conclusion that well, back then they probably wouldn't know I was trans. They probably would know there's something wrong with me. But that was the worst part. Actually, it helped me, because later on I was working in classified arenas. And I learned in order to do that, you have to know about cover stories and how to protect information and so on and so on. But I was pre-evolved, man. I'd been covering up stuff since I was 4. So actually that helped, but it was not good for socially. And it probably kept me away from academia. Which I didn't like anyway, but it probably kept me away from that. So it did interfere with my life in significant ways.
Thank you.
So through your PowerPoint, I can see that the history of trans issues and the science of trans issues have been a ever-evolving thing. So how do you think science communication can really help allyship within the trans community and have people understand trans issues better? And this could be in the science comm community or history comm community, just education in general.
Okay, I think there's interference in the education domain between the public. I think there's some people not well motivated that try to obfuscate transgender issues. There's a guy named Matt Walsh, right, who just is making money on a movie called What is a Woman, in which he essentially confounds women and females consistently over and over again. We have to stamp that out. We have to be clear about our definitions about what's sex and what's gender. That's a beginning part. The next thing is we don't support transgender research much. The reason is it's not listed as an ailment. It's not an illness. It's not a disorder. And the NIH funds disorders, research on disorders. So there is a lot of work that just doesn't get done. For example, there's an international group that's looking at the genetic makeup of transgender people, and they have some 10,000 samples of people who are either transgender or not. And a couple years ago, they applied for a grant from the NIH, and they got turned down. So that we don't really fund objective research like we should. But of what we do know, people take advantage of that, usually because they confound it with sex, ha ha ha, and that's not what it's about. It's about a genetic gender predisposition that compels is not too strong a word, you to join up with one gender category. So those are some suggestions. Does that help? Thank you.
Hi there. First of all, thank you for coming to this talk. I appreciate it. My question, broadly speaking, is about how we go about sort of objectively or externally verifying claims made in this space. I imagine if you asked a lot of people whether they have personally experienced like a communication with the Holy Spirit or something, you would get a lot of people to say that they had experienced that, and
right.
Probably in this room there's not a lot of people who think that's a real thing.
Right.
And as far as I have been able to tell, a lot of the research in this area more or less just asks people how they feel, like what their internal identification is. And I'm certainly sympathetic to that, but I don't know how we go about objectively distinguishing those two kinds of claims.
There is genetic research that shows that there is a genetic gender predisposition. And the way they do that is with twin studies. If one twin is an identical twin, that is, they start out with the same genetics, if one twin is trans, then the other twin is trans about half the time. And that's pretty good in terms of genetic predisposition. IQ and height, is only about 60%. So we have pretty good evidence that, and of course there are a lot of objections to people using genetic information to classify transgender people, but that's an issue down the road. But there's pretty good evidence that it's not just asking them what their genetic predisposition is. There's evidence that it exists, and there are genetic markers that have been discovered. That there are about 400 of them on the human genome, and out of 100,000 genes, and they correlate with. They differentiate between being transgender and not, given the appropriate controls. So there is a bit of information, objective information, that shows that being transgender is a real phenomenon. It's not real science, real objective biological phenomena. It's not a pipe dream.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. So my niece just came out recently, and unfortunately my sister didn't take it well.
Right.
So I tried to explain to my sister that my niece is just basically the same person, just a happier, better version of herself. I was wondering if you had any other things to add or say to help family members understand a little bit better, or at least like
Right.
chill.
Chill, yeah. Yeah, I've been in a number of support group meetings where parents come in like that. Basically, it takes time. As you say, they're still the same child, and it takes parents a while to get used to the changes or even understand it. Of course, some people don't know anything about it. They come into it cold. And then there are some parents who are just downright put their foot down and say, that's just not going to happen. I'm not going to have that kid be treated as a transgender child. Yeah, we have pretty good luck with that because courts typically are sympathetic to kid getting the medical care he needs. But yeah, it takes time and it takes getting used to. So that one piece of advice is to go to a support group meeting, go to PFLAG, which started out being parents of gay and lesbian kids, but it's almost now exclusively transgender kids. So yeah, so that would be what I'd suggest.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hey, it's just two questions. First question, I'm trying to keep them quick because we're almost at the end.
Yeah.
In some of the studies that, of course, I've looked at, it seems that, after trans men and women go through full transition,
Yeah.
some of the psychological requirements, like they still need therapists afterwards, some studies show that decreased about 15%. So, there's a 15% reduction after full transition. Do you know any studies that show a greater percentage and drop of...
You're talking about revision back from transition?
No. When they transition...
Yes.
Of course, there's studies, they need the psychological therapists, to make sure that... are there any studies that show a greater than a 15% drop after people transition fully?
No. I think there are a number of studies that show that transition is not the end of the support that the people need. And I think that's now well established in European medical procedure as well, which it wasn't for a long time. As soon as you transitioned, got a surgery, they were dropping you. But now that's reopened because it looks like transgender, they still have problems. Some of their problems didn't go away.
Absolutely, yeah.
They still have interpersonal problems and family problems. So yes, now the policy is that a transgender person has to, it's advisable for them to have a provider in case they need it after transition.
And the last question is about, it's a very similar thing that I saw with some of the children in studies where after, affirmative treatment or at least supportive environments are brought, there is a significant decrease in the suicidal rates and suicidal ideations with children. But even after that, a lot of the information out there shows that it's much higher than the normal children, normal as defined by societal standards.
Well,
Is there any research coming out to show better things that we can do scientifically to help reduce that in children, because it still seems to be substantially higher than normal
Right.
children. So
Well,
anything we can do to reduce it. That's my only
Right.
question.
The other thing you got to realize is that a lot of kids, transgender or not, commit suicide at an early age. That's just, so yes, they're constantly looking at that in terms of, will these new procedures reduce the numbers? And of course, that's one of the objectives, but the main objective is to make the kid happy and feel like they're whole.
So it's still ongoing.
Yeah, they're still working
Okay.
on that.
Okay,
Yeah,
makes sense.
absolutely.
Perfect. Okay, hopefully they come up with something good soon.
Yeah,
Okay,
no.
that's all my question.
Hello.
Yes.
So when it comes to the transgender community, I've found a large disconnect when talking to people about, like, if a trans person is talking to someone who's not as educated in
I couldn't understand you.
Oh, sorry. If a transgender person is talking to someone who is not as educated in transgender politics or the community,
Right.
a big issue I found is that their word, the transgender person's word, is kind of taken as gospel. They're seen as a representative or an ambassador. And I think that's a big issue. And I don't know a good way of communicating that, every person has different ideas and different opinions. So how do you feel is a good way of going about that issue?
You mean from the point of view of the transgender person?
Yes.
Yes. My experience is that, yes, they are definite, yes, they're insistent, but they're smart. They know they wouldn't have gotten that far if they didn't realize that other people have trouble understanding. Lord knows their parents have trouble understanding. So I think a lot of them are pretty good at conveying that information, or know someone who does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. As a proud parent of a transgender son, I'm curious if you've seen research that talks about, apparently in a number of Western European countries, the sort of proportion of children presenting gender identity clinics or for affirmative treatment
Right.
has changed in the last sort of 10 or 20 years from a majority of male to female transitioning
Right.
children to now a sort of slight majority of female to male. Have you seen anything behind that trend?
I'm constantly looking at that. Even before the 2000s, there were lots of papers about that, and it wobbled all over the place from country to country. Now that we have these treatment options, it's pretty close to 50-50, although there are a lot of parents don't believe that. But the last numbers I've seen are pretty close to 50-50. And there's no reason to believe otherwise. So, but you constantly have to look at that to see, to monitor what that situation is. But they still should get treatment, doesn't, obviously. But yeah, it's about 50-50 now.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all for coming. So, thank you for coming.